His Father's Son Part 1. After his wife's death, Mason Grew took the momentous step of selling out his business and moving from Wingfield, Connecticut to Brooklyn for years. He had secretly nursed the hope of such a change, but had never dared suggest it to Mrs. Grew, a woman of immutable habits. Mr. Grew himself was attached to Wingfield, where he had grown up, prospered, and become what the local press described as prominent he was. Attached to his ugly brick house with sandstone trimmings, a NDA, cast iron area railing neatly sanded to match to the similar row of houses across the street, the trolley wires forming a kind of aerial pathway between, and the sprawling vista closed by the steeple of the church which he and his wife had always attended, and where their only child had been baptized. It was hard to snap all these threads of association, visual and sentimental, yet still harder now that he was alone to live so far from his boy. Ronald Grew was practicing law in New York at ND. There was no more chance of returning to live at Wingfield than of a river's flowing inland from the sea. Therefore, to be near him, his father must move, and it was characteristic of Mr. Grew and of the situation generally that the translation when it took place was to Brooklyn and not to New York. Why you bury yourself in that hole? I can't think it had been Ronald's comment, and Mr. Grew simply replied that rents were lower in Brooklyn and that he had heard a house that would suit him in reality. He had said to himself, being the only recipient of his own confidences, that if he went to New York, he might be on the boy's mind, whereas if he lived in Brooklyn, Ronald would always have a good excuse for not popping over to see him every other day. The sociological isolation of Brooklyn, combined with its geographical nearness, presented in fact the precise conditions for Mr. GR's case. He wanted to be near enough to New York to go there often, to feel under his feet the same pavement he had Ronald trod, to sit now and then in the same theaters, and find on his breakfast table the journals which with increasing frequency inserted Ronald's name in the sacred bounds of society column. Had always been a trial to Mr. Grew to have to wait 24 hours to read that among those present was Mr. Ronald Grew. Now he had it with his coffee and left it on the breakfast table to the perusal of a hired girl cosmopolitan enough to do it justice. In such ways Brooklyn attested the advantage of its property to New York, while remaining as regards Ronald's duty to his father as remote and inaccessible as Wingfield. It was not that Ronald shirked his filial obligations, but rather because of his heavy sense of them, that Mr. Grew so persistently sought to minimize and lighten them. It was he who insisted to Ronald on the immense difficulty of getting from New York to Brooklyn. Any way you look at it, it makes a big hole of the day, and there's not much use in the ragged rim left. You say you're dining out next Sunday, then I forbid you come over here for lunch. Do you understand me? Sir, you disobey at the risk of your father's malediction. Where did you say you were dining with the Waltham bankers again? Why, that's the second time in 3 weeks, ain't it? Big blowout. I suppose gold plate and orchids opera. Singers and afterward, well, you'd be in a nice box if there was a fog in a river, and he got hung up halfway over. That would be a handsome return for the attention Mrs. Bankshire has shown you, singling out a whippersnapper like you twice in 3 weeks. What's the daughter's name? Daisy. No, sir. Don't you come fooling round here next Sunday, or I'll set the dogs on you. And you wouldn't find me in. Anyhow, come to think of it, I'm lunching out myself. As it happens, yes, sir, lunching out. Is there anything especially comic in my lunching out? I don't often do it, you say. Well, there's no reason why I never should. Who with why? With old Dr. Bleecker. Dr. Olive Bleecker. Now, you wouldn't know about him. He's only an old friend of your mother's and mine. Gradually, Ronald's insistence became less difficult to overcome with his customary sweetness and tact. As Mr. Grew put it, he began to take the hint to give in to the old gentleman's growing desire for solitude. I'm set in my ways, Ronnie. That's about the size of it. I like to go ticking along like a clock. I always did. And when you come bouncing, and I never feel sure there's enough for dinner, or that I haven't sent Maria out for the evening, and I don't want the neighbors to see me opening my own door to my son. That's the kind of cringing snob don't give me away with you. I want them to think I keep 4 or 5 powdered flunkies in a hall day and night, same as the lobby of one of those Fifth Avenue hotels. And if you pop over when you're not expected, how am I going to keep up the bluff? Ronald yielded after the proper amount of resistance, his intuitive sense In every social transaction, of the proper amount of, forced to be expended was one of the qualities his father most admired in him. Mr. Grew's perceptions in this line were probably more acute than his son suspected the souls of short, thick-set men with chubby features, mutton chop whiskers, and pale eyes peering between folds of fat like almond kernels in half-split shell souls thus encased do not reveal themselves to the casual scrutiny as delicate emotional instruments. But in spite of the dense disguise in which he walked, Mr. Grew Six cared to look might have put new life into the discredited theory of prenatal influences, at any rate if the young man owed his beauty his distinction, and his winning manner to the dreams of one of his parents it was. Certainly to those of Mr. Grew, who while outwardly devoting his life to manufacture and dissemination of grooves, secure suspender buckle moved in an enchanted inward world, people with all the figures of romance. In this high company, Mr. Grew cut as brilliant a figure as anything. Well, Mr. Grew constantly affirmed to himself that the boy was not a genius, but barring this slight deficiency, he was almost everything that a parent could wish, even at Harvard. He had managed to be several desirable things at once: writing poetry in the college magazine, playing delightfully by ear, acquitting himself honorably in his studies, and yet holding his own in the fashionable sporting set that formed as it were the gateway of the temple of society. Mr. Grew's idealism did not preclude Anner's. Simpler, their voices more agreeable, their views more consent with his own than those of the leading citizens of Wingfield. But then he had met very few Ronald's. Sympathies needed no urging in the same direction. He took naturally, dauntlessly to all the high and exceptional things about which his father's imagination had so long sheepishly and ineffectually hovered from the start. He was what Mr. Grew had dreamed of being, and so precise, so detailed was Mr. Grew's vision of his own imagine. When the actual Grew had passed from the factory to the bookkeeper's desk, his invisible double had been reading law at Columbia, precisely again what Ronald did. But it was when a young man left the paths laid out for him by the parental hand and cast himself boldly on the world that his adventures began to bear the most astonishing resemblance to those of the unrealized Mason Grew. It was in New York that the scene of this hypothetical being's first exploits had always been laid, and it is connection with it, yet it was. The buckle had seen him through Groton, Harvard, and the law school, and had permitted him to enter the office of a distinguished corporation lawyer, instead of being enslaved to some sordid business. With quick returns, the buckle had been Ronald's fairy godmother, yet his father did not blame him for abhorring and disowning it. Mr. Grew himself often bitterly regretted having bestowed his name on the instrument of his material success, though at the time as his father as old buckles, and when Mr. Grew heard the epithet, he understood in a flash that the buckle was a thing to blush for. It was too late then to dissociate his name from it, or to ease from the hoardings of the entire continent the picture of two gentlemen, one contorting himself in the abject effort to repair a broken brace, while the careless ease of the other's attitude proclaimed his trust in the secure suspender buckle. These records were indelible, but Ronald could at least be spare out your wistfulness, which escaped his wife's analysis. Well, of course she could have written beautifully, she rejoined with admiring eyes. Written me, Mr. Grew. Became sardonic. Why those letters weren't they beautiful, I'd like to know. The couple exchanged a glance, innocently elusive and amused on the wife's part, and charged with a sudden tragic significance on the husband's. Well, I gotta be going along to the office now, he merely said, dragging himself out of his rocking chair. This had happened matter. Expect me tomorrow afternoon. Mr. Grew received the telegram after breakfast to peruse it. He had lifted his eye from a paragraph of the morning paper describing a fancy dress dinner which had taken place the night before at the Hamilton Glytons for the housewarming of their new Fifth Avenue palace. Among the couples who afterward danced in the Poets' Quadrille were Miss Daisy Bankshire, looking more than usually lovely as Laura, and Mr. Ronald Grew as the young Petrarch, and Lau was lovely. He had often seen her photograph in the papers, seen her represented in every conceivable attitude of the mundane game, fondling her prized bulldog, taking offense on her thoroughbred, dancing a gavotte all patches and plumes, or fingering a guitar all tulle and lilies. and once he had caught a glimpse of her at the theater, hearing that Ronald was going to a fashionable first night with the bankers. Mr. had for once overcome his repugnance to following his son's movements and had secured for H such shining hair, needless to say that the real Mason. Grew had never found himself in so enviable a situation. The late Mrs. Crewe had no more resembled Miss Daisy Bankshire than he had looked like the happy, victorious Ronald, and the mystery was that from their dull faces, their dull endearments, the miracle of Ronald should have sprung. It was almost fantastically, as if the boy had been a changeling, a child of a Latian night, whom the divine companion of Mr. Grew's early reveries had. Secretly, the wonder of his audacity had struck her dumb, and when she recovered her voice, it was to fling a taunt at him. Don't be too discouraged, have you ever thought of trying Addie Wicks's? All Wingfield would have understood the job Addie Wicks's was the dullest girl in town, and a year later, he had married Addie Wicks's. He looked up from the perusal of Ronald's telegram with this memory in mind. Now, at last, his dream was coming true. His boy would taste of the joys that had mocked his thwarted youth. He had been saving up his income for just such a contingency. His own wants were few. He had transferred the Wingfield furniture to Brooklyn, and his sitting room was a replica of that in which the long years of his married life had been spent. Even the Florida carpet on which Ronald's tottering footsteps had been taken was carefully matched when it became two. Threadbare, and on the marble center table with its chenille fried cover and bunch of dyed pampas grass lay the illustrated long sight to him during the long drowsy years, and he felt her kindness, her equanimity, where formerly he had only acted her obtuseness. And from the chair he glanced up at a large discolored photograph on the wall above with a brittle brown wreath suspended on a corner of the frame. The photograph represented a young man with a poetic necktie and untraveled hair, leaning negligently against a Gothic chairback, a roll of music in his hand, and beneath was scrolled a bar of chopa with the words "Ife I." Never, she gasped out helplessly when they had regained their hotel bedroom and sat staring back in trance at the evening's evocations. Her large, immovable face was pink and tremulous, and she sat with her hands on her knees, forgetting to roll up her bonnet strings and prepare her curl papers. I'd like to write him just how I felt. I wished I knew how. She burst out suddenly in a final effervescence of emotion. Her husband lifted his head and looked at her. Would you I feel that W to her table at? His boy's charming face had struck him that Ronald's gift for looking his part in life had never so romantically expressed itself other. Young men at such a moment would have been red, damp tight about the collar, but Ronald's cheek was only a shade paler, and the contrast made his dark eyes more expressive. A clear 25,000, yes, sir. That's what I always meant you to have. Mr. Grew leaned back, his hands thrust carelessly in his pockets, as though to divert attention from the agitation. Grew clear his throat. Do they expect more? He asked nervously. He was hardly able to face the pain of inflicting a disappointment on Ronald at the very moment when it counted on putting the final touch to his felicity. Ronald moved uneasily in his chair, and his eyes wandered upward to the laurel wreath photograph of the pianist above his father's head. Is that it? Ronald, speak out. My boy will see. We'll look round. I'll manage somehow. No. The young man interrupted. Abruptly, raising man met his tender look with a gaze of tragic rejection. No, it's not mine, not even in the sense you mean, not in any sense. Can't you understand my feelings? So I don't know how you're feeling. I don't know what you're talking about. Are you too proud to touch any money you haven't earned? Is that what you're trying to tell me? No, it's not that you must know. Mr. G.R. flushed the rim of his bristling whiskers. No, what can you speak? Ronald hesitated, and the two men faced. Happen what was sure to happen. Mr. Grew's question wavered on his lip and passed into a tremulous laugh. Is it something I've done that you don't approve of? It is the buckle you're ashamed of? Ronald Grew. Ronald laughed too impatiently. The buckle? No, I'm not ashamed. The buckle? Not any more than you are. He returned with sudden bright flush. But I'm ashamed of all I owe to it all I owe to you. When he broke off and took a few distracted steps across the room, you might make 22, you and she, and resemblances that I couldn't help seeing in myself. How on earth could you suppose? I shouldn't guess. I always thought you gave me the letters as a way of telling me. Mr. G.R. slowly from his chair. The letters Dabrowski's, letters Ronald nodded. With white lips, you must remember giving them to me the day after the funeral. Mr. Grew nodded back, of course. I wanted you to have everything your mother. Value, well, how could I help knowing after that, knowing what Mr. Grew stood staring helpless at you were Fun Dabrowski's son Ronald. Made a mute sign of assent. I see. And what did you mean to do? I meant to wait till I could earn my living, and then repay you as far as I could ever repay you. But now that there's a chance of my marrying, and your generosity overwhelms me. I'm obliged to speak. I see, said Mr. Grew again. He let himself down into his chair, looking steadily and not unkindly at the young man sit down. Ronald, let's talk. Ronald made a protesting movement. Is there anything to be his lips? You damp young fool, you haven't told her. Ronald raised his head quickly. Oh, you don't know her, sir. She thinks no worse of me for knowing my secret. She is above and beyond all such conventional prejudices. She's proud of my parentage. She straightened his slim young shoulders. As I'm proud of it. Yes, sir, proud of it. Mr. Grew sank back into his chair with a dry laugh. Well, you ought to become a good stock. And your father's son, every inch of you. He laughed again as 30:36. Though the... What do you mean, don't they tell their own story? I suppose they did when I gave him to you, but you've given it a twist that needs straightening out. Mr. Square's elbows on the table, and looked at the young man across the gift books and the dyed pampas grass. I wrote all the letters that Dabrowski, answered Ronald, gave back his look in frowning perplexity. You wrote them? I don't understand. His letters are all addressed to my mother, yes, and he thought he was corresponding with her, but I am always... Plenty of fight in me, but inside of myself, it was kind of lonesome, and the outside didn't attract callers. He laughed again with an apologetic gesture toward his broad, blinking face. When I went round with the other young fellows, I was always a forlorn hope, the one that had to eat the drumsticks and dance with the leftovers. As sure as there was a blighter at a picnic, I had to swing her and feed her and drive her home. And all the time I was mad. After all the things you got poet E.W. York in the hole. Place went wild about him. I'd never heard any good music, but I'd always had an inkling of what it must be like, though I couldn't tell you to this day. How I knew, well, your mother read about him in the papers too, and she thought it would be the swagger thing to go to New York and hear him play. So we went. I'll never forget that evening. Your mother wasn't easily stirred up. She never seemed to need to let off steam. But that night she seemed to understand the way I fell silent with lowered eyes. That's how it began, and that's where I thought it would end. But it didn't, because Drosky answered his first letter was dated January 10th, 1872. I guess you'll find I'm correct. Well, I went back to hear him again, and I wrote him after the performance, and he answered again, and after that we kept it up for 6 months. Your mother always copied the letters and signed them. She seemed to think it was a kind of joke, and she was proud of his answering my letters. But Chenevo, Europe, he sent your mother a last little note, and that picture hanging up there. Mr. Jar paused again, and both men lifted their eyes to the photograph. Is that all? Ronald slowly asked. That's all, every bit of it, said Mr. Grew. And my mother never even spoke to Dabrowski? Never. She never even saw him, but that once in New York at his concert. The blood crept again to Ronald's face. Are you sure of that, sir? He asked in a trembling voice. Sure as I am that I'm sitting here. Why, S.H. a great musician, but a great man. There was nothing beautiful. He didn't see nothing fine. He didn't feel for 6 months. I breathed his air, and I've lived on it ever since. Do you begin to understand a little now? Yes, a little. But why write in my mother's name? Why make it sentimental? Correspondence. Mr. Grew reddened to his bald temples. Why, I tell you, began that way as a kind of joke. And when I saw that the first letter pleased and interested, I was afraid to tell him. I couldn't tell to her as a young man. Insisted. Well, they weren't bad, said Mr. Grew dryly. But I'll tell you one thing, Ronnie, he added suddenly. Ronald raised his head with a quick glance, and Mr. Grew continued. I'll tell you where the best of those letters is. It's in you. If it hadn't been for that one look at life, I couldn't have made you what you are. Oh, I know you've done a good deal of your own making, but I've been there behind you all the time, and you'll never know the work. I spared you in the time that you ain't a romantic. Figure you gotta think yourself. Well, that's natural enough, too. But I'll tell you what it proves. It proves you're my son, right enough. If any more proof was needed for it's just the kind of full nonsense I used to feel at your age. And if there's anybody here to laugh at, it's myself, and not you and you. Can laugh at me just as much as you like End Off is father-son.